We are in 1 Samuel chapter 18 tonight. Actually, I think there might have been a few verses on the tail end of chapter 17 that we still need to look at. But that's all well and good because the chapter division probably isn't very well placed anyway. I know that that's a shocking statement to hear from me since I just love chapter divisions in the Bible. But here we're actually going to pick up in verse 55 of chapter 17. The David and Goliath story is... Well, I contended last week that it's not really David versus Goliath so much as it is David versus Saul. The great Philistine giant who challenged Israel, we knew how that story was going to end ahead of time. David said how it was going to end. He said anybody who blasphemes the army of God like that, anyone who curses the Lord's armies, well, they cannot stand. The Lord will destroy them. But it is Saul, who was head and shoulders above everybody else, who should have gone out to fight the giant, who was instead trying to bribe somebody else in his army into doing it for him. And it is David, who is not in any way militarily impressive looking, who goes out and actually defeats Goliath. And in verse 55, can I get a volunteer to read from verse 55 of chapter 17 down to verse 5 of chapter 18? Go ahead.
As soon as Saul saw David about to get the Philistines, he said to Abner, commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistines, Abner took him and brought him to Saul. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan knit to the soul of David. Jonathan loved him, his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him, his soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, armor, and even his sword and his bow in his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul sent the man over the men of this was good in the sight of all the people, also in the sight of Saul's servant.
Okay. Now, the Septuagint actually omits everything that James just read, but here we have it in the Hebrew Bible, and so it's come down to us in that way. And Saul starts off asking, well, whose son is this young man who just killed the giant like that? Which, sounds a little odd because you remember back in chapter 16, David was Saul's harp player and he had become Saul's armor bearer. And then you read in chapter 17, David's had a conversation with Saul about this. So did Saul just forget who David was? Well, I mean, is the story being told a little bit out of sequence maybe? I think that that's likely. We, of course, have mentioned this before, but ancient peoples did not always tell stories in chronological order. They sometimes would jump around to this event or that event, and they would move around in circles. And so we don't really need to expect these things to be chronological. But can anybody else think of another reason why Saul might ask, whose son is this young man? Maybe something from earlier in chapter 17. Well, he's the armor. No, that's. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's part of it. Okay, Jenna? Yeah, remember back in verse 25, whenever David asks, what will be done for the person who kills Goliath? And the people respond, and they say in verse 25 that it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him and with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and will make his father's house free in Israel. His father's house would be exempt from taxation or service or something like that, which, gives a practical reason why Saul would want to know who his father was, so that he can exempt him from all of these different things. Also involved in this is the fact that whoever kills Goliath gets to marry the king's daughter. That's going to be relevant as we get into chapter 18 as well. Now, David identifies himself as the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. And it is after the point at which it is after the point at which David finishes speaking to Saul that Jonathan notices David and he loves David for his victory. He loves him as himself. You can't miss the allusion to Leviticus 19:18 that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The soul of Jonathan, it says, was knit to the soul of David. It was bound to the soul of David. Let me ask you a question. What is the basis for this friendship? Why would Jonathan love David so much?
Either because Goliath or because
well, okay, which one of those is it? It's probably because he killed Goliath. Okay, yeah, and the context of this conversation is that David just killed the mighty Philistine. This was the Philistine champion that Saul had failed to kill in spite of his kingly might. This is the Philistine champion that every Israelite in Israel had failed to kill in spite of the fact that the Lord had made promises to the nation. And, interestingly enough, you know who else doesn't kill the giant? And we'll see who reads my Facebook. Yes, Jonathan did not kill Goliath either, which is kind of interesting. Because, has Jonathan been a kind of do you think Jonathan's been an upstanding guy up to this point in Samuel? He's been a good warrior, he's had a pretty good perspective. In chapter 14 in verse 6 it says, but Jonathan was the one who said, the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. Jonathan was a military hero in Israel. You know who else? Saul was also a military hero in Israel. And Jonathan's response to see David who has basically surpassed him at this point, Jonathan's response is to love David. Now we're going to see that Saul has a little bit of a different response. When David surpasses him, Saul gets kind of jealous and kind of angry and kind of paranoid. Jonathan removes his armor, removes his robes, and gives them to David. Why would he do this? Why would Jonathan do this? What does it usually mean in the Bible when somebody takes their clothes and gives them to somebody else? Let me ask that question. Okay. Position, relationship. Jen. With what? Yes. In Numbers chapter 20, whenever Aaron was about to die, they went up on the mountain, and Aaron removed his high priestly robes, and they gave them to his son Eleazar to signify that Eleazar would be the new high priest. Or we might think of 1 Kings chapter 19, where Elijah takes his robe and gives it to Elisha, the one whom he thinks is supposed to succeed him. There's also an example in Isaiah chapter 22 and verse 21, where Hezekiah's major domo, Shebna, his robes are removed, albeit maybe it's a little more forcible in the context of Isaiah. His robes are removed and given to Eliakim along with his office. It's a symbol that his office has been handed over. Now, that said, when Jonathan gives David the royal armor, what does that seem to suggest? Okay, yeah, devotion to David, but something else too. That's a good question. I mean, I think Jonathan would be aware at least of the fact that the Lord was going to take the kingdom away from Saul and give it to somebody else. I don't think he missed that detail. But you'll notice something else. In almost every encounter that David and Jonathan have in the text, there's almost always a reference to the fact that David is going to be king. David is going to be the next king. And just a couple of examples. In chapter 20, in verse 14, Jonathan makes the comment. He says that he makes the comment, if I am still alive, will you not show me loving kindness of the Lord that I may not die? He has this impression that, David is going to be the one in the position of power and not him. Again, in chapter 20 and verses 31 and 32, Saul tells Jonathan, as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom can be established. Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he must surely die. And again in verse 17 of chapter 23, Jonathan makes it really explicit. He says, do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also. That's 1 Samuel 23 and verse 17. At some point, Jonathan seems to become aware that David, and not him, is going to be the next king. And Jonathan seems to have this optimistic perspective on the future, that he'll be there for that, which he ultimately is not. He's killed in battle in chapter 31. But still, there is something to this idea. Now, by giving David the royal armor, I don't know if he's literally abdicating the throne, but there's a certain symbolism to that gesture that I don't think we can ignore. Jonathan giving David his war weapon seems like an acknowledgement of his superiority. It's very different from when Saul tries to give David the armor in chapter 17, which I think is at least well-intentioned, albeit ill-conceived attempt to help David. But Jonathan gives David the armor after the battle, and makes this covenant with him. And similarly, Saul promotes David. David goes out wherever Saul sends him. What does that mean, going out? What are we talking about there in verse 5 of chapter 18? He followed directions, okay, but what does that usually? What does that mean? David went out wherever Saul sent him. Went out doing what? Did he go out to buy groceries? To fight the battles? Whose job was that? Should have been Saul's job, right? It's the job that the people wanted him for. In chapter 8 and verse 20, give us a king to go out and fight our battles. In chapter 8 and verse 20. Saul promoted David over the man of war, a job that he would ordinarily have, but he sort of delegates it to David. So now David's doing kind of the kingly job. And as this chapter unfolds, we're going to see David doing more and more kingly things. Okay. That's what I have down to verse 5. I suppose there's other things we could get into, but does anybody have any comments or questions down to verse 5 of chapter 18?
And it's very telling that Paul's servant, David, had found pleasure. And if anybody that
Yes.
and David's finding.
Yes, in fact, I think that's probably one of the biggest things we're supposed to notice in this whole chapter, and we're going to see it as we keep going. Throughout this chapter, one thing becomes clear. Everybody loves David. Jonathan loves David. David pleases the people in verse 5. David pleases Saul's servants. The people start singing about David. We're going to see that in a little bit. In verses 14 and verse 28, we see that Yahweh is with David. He has the Lord's approval, which is pretty big and important. In verse 16, Israel and Judah love David. In verse 20 and 28, Michal, the daughter of Saul, loves David. David's name is highly esteemed by Saul's commander in verse 30. Everybody loves David, with one exception that we'll see in a moment. Can I get somebody to read verses 6 through 11? Oh, sorry. Yeah, you had something?
It's also kind of, this is almost clear.
Yes.
From Eli too.
Yeah, I forgot to bring that up. Yes, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, there was a remark made that, where is that?
We didn't compare that on.
Did we compare that? Okay, yeah, we made the comparison between David and Samuel before. In 1 Samuel 2 and verse 26, the boy Samuel was growing in stature and in favor both with the Lord and with men. There is that kind of comparison going on as well. Just as Samuel grew in favor with God and men, David is also growing in favor with God and men. Good. Okay, now read from verses 6 through 11.
Happened as they were coming, they returned from the Philistines, but the women from Israel and dancing with tambourines, praise, and sang it. This David. Then Saul became very angry. Cried to David, "Thou now, what more should we have but the kingdom?" Saul looked at David. Now it came about the next day, God, finally upon Saul. David saw David heart with his Saul hurled his spear. Thought, "I will." David
Yeah, okay. All right, now, as David returns from killing the Philistine, and again, you see how the chronology is kind of jumping around a little bit. We're coming back from killing Goliath, and the women come out to meet Saul, and they're singing, and they're dancing, and there's instruments, and their song, Saul has slain his thousands, David has slain his 10,000s. And it sounds such a wonderful song, even though David has technically only killed one person at this point. But I guess that's what you get for don't interpret it too literally. They ask you a question, speaking of people who interpret things too literally. Does Saul interpret this song correctly? Something to think about. You know, I mean, we see how Saul reacts to this song. They've ascribed thousands to me and 10,000s to David. They think David's better than me. You know, they're trying to take the kingdom away from me and give it to David. Which, in the Lord's ruling, that is what's happening. Dennis, you have something?
That makes sense to me that women are celebrating this victory and they decide that
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think
Well, there is something else going on here, too. There's a Hebrew poetic device called ascending numerology. I'll just give you some examples. In Psalm 91, in verse 7, it says, 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not approach you. Well, I mean, that's not really trying to make a comparison between somebody's side and their right hand. It's just using one number and then using a bigger number to draw a poetic parallel. You see another example of this in Deuteronomy 32:30. How could one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them? The numbers aren't strictly relevant. They're just, small number puts a bigger number to flight. Micah 6 and verse 7, does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? There's a couple of other examples using different numbers too. Amos chapter 1, for instance, says, there's this repeated phrase, for 3 transgressions and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment of, and fill in the blank. There's like 7 or 8 different nations he goes through there. He's not trying to say something literal with the numbers. He's simply saying, here's a number, here's a bigger number. Hebrew poetry likes to do that. In Proverbs chapter 6 in verse 16, there are 6 things that the Lord hates, yea, 7 that are an abomination to him. Well, did he just forget that there was a 7th thing and suddenly tack it on? Or no, but it's a poetic device is what it is. I think something similar is going on here in 1 Samuel 18. There's a poetic device. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. In other words, we've got the leadership that's just knocking the Philistines all over the place. But like many modern bad English interpreters today, Saul doesn't even interpret the Hebrew poetry correctly. So go figure there. Jenna, do you have something?
Even if the numbers don't matter, though, wouldn't it seem the song arguably what it was?
Perhaps. I think that there might be something to that, as well. But Saul, I think, goes even farther than they're intending it, and really uses it to just fuel his paranoia.
I don't think they're saying, let's get rid of Saul, kill Saul, David.
Yeah. I mean, this is the point where Saul kind of starts to perceive David as a threat. And I think that above all, there's a lesson here about just assuming the worst intentions of people with ambiguous evidence, we got this song, this Hebrew poetry song. Let's read the worst possible meaning into it. and assume they're just trying to stage a coup against me or something. Well, I mean, how often do we do that? You know, we take some ambiguous statement or some ambiguous idea from somebody and we assign the worst possible motives to them. Now, that's not charitable at all. It's not merciful in any way. James.
Also, the act here trying to kill David, like God asked him to anoint David as king. Samuel said something. If Saul here, he's going to kill him.
Yeah. Now we see that Samuel's fear that Saul was going to turn on him and get kind of angry and try to kill becomes very much a reality in this chapter. And of course, Saul, we start seeing in verses 10 and 11, Saul tries to kill David with a spear. The Septuagint actually omits this because Saul later again tries to kill David with a spear. How Saul has slain his thousands when he continually misses David with the spear is completely lost on me. But throughout this chapter, just as many times as we see people loving David, we see Saul hating David. Saul is angry at the praise given to David in verse 8. He's suspicious of David in verse 9. He tries to kill David in verse 11. He's afraid of him in verse 12. He tries to remove David from his presence in verse 13. Interesting that Saul's fear actually becomes a basis for a military promotion. In verse 15, Saul dreads David. In verses 18 and 21 and 25, he tries to get David to accidentally die in battle. In verses 28 and 29, he's even more afraid of David. He is David's continual enemy. Yes, Jen? Yeah, that does sound pretty familiar, although you're looking into the future for it to sound familiar. But yes, yes, in 2 Samuel 11, David does something pretty similar to what Saul tries to do to him when he tries to get Uriah the Hittite killed in battle. And David actually succeeds at doing that. But, in that case, you see him kind of behaving a little bit like Saul did in that story. There's the differences, and we'll talk about that when we get there, but it is important to note that. Saul actually throws a spear 3 times in the narrative. Here, chapter 19, and in chapter 20, although he does it, he throws the spear at Jonathan in the last scene. David is playing the harp, just like before. Why was David playing the harp? To soothe his nerves, right? Okay, there's a evil. It's the way you get the evil spirit to leave Saul. And this time, the evil spirit is on Saul. And does the evil spirit leave him? No. Well, why doesn't it work this time? Why doesn't David's harp playing work this time? Well, this affliction was from God. Well, was it from God before? Something's changed here. What's changed?
God has apparently appears to me he wanted David out of Saul's presence. Happened.
Yeah.
Saul proved scary this.
I think this is a sign of Saul's worsening spiritual condition. His disobedience cost him the kingship, but there was a point where the songs of David could still kind of soothe him and put him in his right mind. But now he's being driven mad even further by the evil spirit from God. His heart is hardened to the point that there's almost no remedy to his rage. And in chapter 19, the Spirit of the Lord actually comes on Saul again. Saul doesn't do what he really did before. Instead, he acts like a madman. It's interesting, actually, the word for rave and the word for act like a madman and the word for prophesy are all the same word in Hebrew. So in verse 10, when it says he raved in the midst of his house, you could technically translate that he prophesied in the midst of his house. That's probably not what he was doing, though. So that's you got to be careful with the semantic range of words. But it's still interesting to see that. The Spirit of God causes Saul to lapse into lunatic ravings and absurd behavior. Saul is the closest thing in the Bible we get to, for lack of a better term, somebody with mental illness. And the bulk of his behavior in this chapter, or the bulk of his behavior ultimately, becomes self-inflicted. He gets into a vicious cycle and he can no longer help himself. There's no going back. It all goes back to chapter 13 and verse 12. When Saul knew what was wrong and he forced himself and did it anyway. At that point, we force ourselves to do something we know is wrong. Well, it becomes progressively easier and easier and easier to force ourselves to do evil things until eventually, we can't stop forcing ourselves. Now we are completely forced. Saul's greatest enemy in this story. Who's Saul's greatest enemy in this story? It's not David. It's not the Philistines. It's not Goliath. It's himself. More than anybody else.
God.
Yeah. That all ties together into this. It's, often are we our own worst enemies, I wonder. That's what Saul is here. He's just, David's not out to get him. Nobody in his court is out to get him, but he suddenly becomes suspicious of everybody around him. And even those who are closest to him, even his very family members, he becomes suspicious of them. He tries to kill some of them. He just doesn't trust anybody anymore. And it all goes back, I think, to chapter 13, when he started forcing himself to do things that didn't line up with what God wanted. Okay. Any comments or questions down there? We got to move a little faster. Can I get somebody to read from verses 12 to 19?
Saul was afraid.
Verse 19.
This all said, here is my oldest daughter. I will give her to you as a wife. Will be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battle. I cannot be against him. David said to Saul, who am I? What is my life?
Some of this is, of course, things we've already talked about. Like Samuel, David is growing in favor with God and man. Saul becomes afraid because he sees that the Spirit of God has departed from him and moved on to David. The obvious movement of the Lord's Spirit has provoked Saul to fear and jealousy. David is that neighbor that's better than Saul that Samuel talked about in chapter 15, and Saul knows it. And so he promotes David in verse 13. I think that's kind of interesting. Just because somebody gives you a gift or promotes you, does that mean they like you? Does it mean they have your best interest at heart? It's clearly not the case with Saul. He promotes David, but it's because he's afraid of him, because he's trying to get rid of him somehow.
The corporate world is one of the best ways to get rid of a bad really fire. You don't have reason to fire. Voting above the level that he can handle on the job, and then you can fire him.
Well, yeah, either that, to prevent an employee from destroying a company, you make him CEO, but, so you can't do anything. Yes. Or something bad will happen to the predecessor. Well, yes, James.
Also kind of like the saying,
yeah, that's true. I guess that's the philosophy that Saul adopted here. But so close, in fact, that he tries to get David to be his son-in-law. He offers Merab, his oldest daughter, to David for a wife. And all you got to do to get my daughter for a wife, David, is do what? Go kill a bunch of Philistines. Well, wait a second. Yeah, didn't Saul already promise his daughter to whoever killed Goliath? Oh yeah, you can have her. Just go fight the Lord's battles first. So there's kind of strings attached to that offer. Apparently, Saul's not exactly a man of his word.
I said that, but I didn't really say
I said that, but I got a few more guys I want you to kill off for me first. But Saul reveals his plan in verse 17. Or Saul's plan is revealed to us in verse 17. He wants the Philistines to kill David. He says, I don't want to kill him myself. I have such bad aim with the spear anyway. No, I want to get the Philistines to kill him off in battle. And, well, David refuses. David doesn't want to do this. Yes?
Parallel to Uriah the Hittite.
Yes, Jenna pointed that out before you came in, I think. But yeah, yeah, no, that's a good point, though. There's something else. Now, David refuses. He's not great in his own estimation, apparently. And Merab, who should have been given to David, it winds up being given to Adriel the Maholathite. Merab went on to have 5 sons with Adriel, and all of them get killed later. We learn that in 2 Samuel chapter 21, whenever the Gibeonites basically decide to get revenge on Saul's family. They say, we want to kill 7 members of his family. And the 7 that David selects are the 5 sons of Merab and the 2 sons of Saul's concubine. Speaking of which, I got to correct something I said in a previous class. I made a comment that Saul only had 1 wife, which is technically true, but he also had a concubine named Rizpah. So I got that one wrong, and I've got to correct that. Saul is not completely monogamous after all. Go figure. Nobody's monogamous in Israel, apparently. So Merab goes on with that. She goes and has 5 children, and they all eventually die. Now Michal, on the other hand, well, can I get somebody to read verses 20 through 30?
Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and they pleased him. So Saul said, I will give her to him. He spared him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law. Saul commanded his servants, take him, say, look, the king has delighted you, and all his servants love him. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke these words at the hearing of David. And David said, does it seem right? Does it seem to you a like thing to be a king's son-in-law? I am a poor and lightly esteemed man. The servants of Saul told him, saying, in this manner David spoke. Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, 100 foreskins of the Philistines, and then Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired, therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 of the men of the Philistines. David brought their foreskins, and gave them full account to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, his wife. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy. Then the prince of the Philistines went out before him. So it was, whenever they went out, David became more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed.
All right. So here we get Michal, the other daughter of Saul. She loves David. Although, interestingly, David is never actually said to love Michal. This is, by the way, outside of the Song of Solomon, this is the only time in the Old Testament that a woman is said to love a man. It's almost always the other way around in the Old Testament. But this is the one exception to that rule, outside of the Song of Solomon. Michal's love for David later actually motivates her to save his life in defiance of her father in chapter 19. The story of Michal, unfortunately, does not have a happy ending either. After David flees, he gives her to another man. Saul gives her to another man. And David demands her back when negotiating with Abner's surrender in 2 Samuel 3. By 2 Samuel 6, Michal's love for David has turned to despising him in her heart. When she sees him dancing before the ark of the Lord, she apparently did not share his enthusiasm for the return of the ark. And we are told that she had no child till the day of her death. So not only does David become king and by marrying the king's daughter, among other things, but also the king's daughter did not have any children of her own, thus extinguishing the line of Saul from the throne of Israel. Now Saul tries to use Michal's love against David. And he gets his servants involved. There's really all sorts of parallels between the murder of Uriah and the attempted murder of David here. I think the only difference mainly is that besides the lack of success on Saul's part, Saul tries to get David to die in battle, getting a wife for himself. David tries to get Uriah to die in battle so he can take Uriah's wife from him. So it's somehow even more despicable. That just kind of makes David sound even more despicable, but that's later on again. Yes, Jen? Mephibosheth had children, yes, but they were not on the throne. Mephibosheth was not considered fit to rule because he was crippled. The family line was still preserved. I suppose if they killed off all the Davidites, then maybe Mephibosheth could have gotten a guy back on the throne. But that's not what winds up happening. What winds up happening is that the throne of that basically the entire kingdom is translated to David's house instead of Saul's. Technically there's probably some legal loophole they could have used, but the point is David becomes king instead of Saul. And we're going to see that when we get more into 2 Samuel, how David kind of maneuvers his way into becoming king over all Israel. With God's help, certainly. And God is the real mastermind behind all of this. But David is, Saul's servants try to convince David to become the king's son-in-law. And David still thinks he's too little in the king's eyes. I can't even afford a proper dowry payment. Why would I want to become the king's son-in-law? Well, Saul, fortunately, says, well, I'm not looking for money. Instead, Saul asks for what is probably the single most gruesome dowry payment imaginable, 100 Philistine foreskins. I just got to wonder, did nobody else think that Saul was being unreasonable here? I get the impression that the servants weren't really in on Saul's intentions here. Because everybody in his servants likes David. But fortunately for David, killing Philistines is something he's good at. And he goes out, and like Samson murdering Philistines at his wedding, David goes out and kills Philistines to get his wedding. And from the Hebrews did not like the Philistines very much. They always refer to them as those uncircumcised Philistines in kind of a derogatory way. Well, here David goes out and circumcises 100 of them, which means he probably has to kill them to do that. 200 of them, excuse me. David actually kills double the number of the Philistines that he needs to in order to get the bridal payment. The people in Saul's family are starting to esteem Saul's hated enemy. And interestingly, that makes Saul even more paranoid and more afraid than before. Getting an endorsement from your family member didn't help him at all. It just made him even more suspicious and more angry. And does Saul have any justification for this at all? No! It's just pure paranoia. Well, how often does that happen, I wonder? In the next chapter, Saul's going to ask Jonathan to kill David. He's going to try to get his own son in on it. It's not going to work, but yes, Jen. I don't know exactly what it is. There's certainly an expression of humility here. I think part of the problem is, of course, David can't afford the bridal payment. It was customary in the ancient Israel. It was customary for the groom to pay a bridal price to the father of the bride and to take her for a wife. Interestingly, it's the opposite way around in India. In India, the bride's family pays the groom's family, but all the same, David could not afford the customary dowry, and Saul, in response, offers him kind of this alternative. And David takes it, because apparently David actually does want to marry her. And so he does go through with this. This, of course, makes Saul even more afraid of David. The father-in-law now becomes a continual enemy of his son-in-law. So that must have made for some rather strained Thanksgiving dinners. All right, so that basically summarizes the chapter in verse 30. David fights the Philistines. He does it more wisely than all of Saul's servants. His name is highly esteemed, and everybody loves David except Saul. And we're going to kind of see some of the blowback from that in chapters 19 and 20. Any comments or questions up to the end of chapter 18? All right, we will pick up with chapter 19 on Sunday morning.